No sé cómo voy a hacer para protegerlo. Esta es más asustadiza que la otra. La tenebra aún siquiera. ¿En qué cabeza cabía que era una buena idea juntar a un par de nenas, ser las responsables de recoger un bien tan preciado?
¡Nos ha tocado el gordo, señor!
Cuidado, al cosechar atraerán sin duda la atención de los testigos.
¿De Ángel parece que está bailando? 6 por 2, 6. Me gusta conseguir.
¡Sangre, sangre!
Esta. Bien. Necesito la jeringa verde.
¡Eres una!
A ver si se puede piratear. Para allá. No se puede. Botiquín, perfecto.
Me dolerá, dame
La cosecha
este.
atraerá la atención de los strippers.
Una niña buena.
¡Haz lo que te digo! ¡Lo estás inventando todo!
¿Qué triste, señor?
Encuentra un conducto y llama a otra pequeña.
Puta madre. Voy a estar así. Pobrecitas las nenas, no se lo merecen. No se las merece, ya se me murieron dos. ¡Ah! Pero no sé dónde carentes salían los otros. Cuando me di cuenta ya los tenía.
Esta está
Estate muy
madura,
atento
señor
a los
Kay.
strippers.
6 por 2, 6 limón. Me gusta conseguir. señor.
Ayúdeme a encontrar a este paciente.
6 por 2 seguimos. Ladronzuela.
¿Por qué demora?
Veo a...
He prometido no hacer daño.
Me gusta conseguir nada. Me
Ah,
hace especial.
¡Rajadlo!
Soy una niña buena, señor.
Ayúdeme a encontrar a este paciente.
ahí se me traba.
Parece triste, señor.
¿Viste?
Flip,
¿Ya está? Allá. No, me le esa mierda. Uf.
Tortugas, señor.
No.
Ángeles no esperan a las tortugas.
Recordatorio de Rapture. Todos tenemos facturas que pagar y la tentación de infringir el toque de queda. Pero infringir el toque de queda no lo es. Quedaos en vuestro lugar, evitaos problemas.
Encima no tenía nada. Estoy por quedar sin cosas. Ay, no tengo. Necesito jeringa. No necesito una película. Necesito.
Lo siento.
Preferiría que no. Está a nada de morir. Está a nada de morir. Qué pequeño. Ah, qué pocos recursos que me dan.
¡La pequeña ha caído!
Sí, ya sé que ha caído.
Ahora tienes que encontrar un conducto y hacer venir a otra pequeña.
Pobrecitas, son como descartables, pareciera. Ah. Sí, pero necesito... Ah, bueno. Esto.
cuidado.
pompas.
Seguro que ahora acudirán más splitters.
Lo sé, lo sé, lo sé, lo sé.
6 por 2, 6 limón. Una niña buena sin muerte. Tiene un bonito ángel.
Voy a tener que abrirte.
Me gusta conseguir. Un bonito ángel.
No, pa.
6 por 2.
Ah. Genial, ahora no tengo forma de curarme. Ah, no, sí tengo forma de curarme. Pero no tengo más jeringas. Ya está recontra mega cansada la mina. Está recontra cansada, estoy matando a todos sus nenas. El de seguridad. Porque no tengo máquina expendedora.
Las niñas estarán mejor contigo. Mejor contigo que solas. Solas en la amenazadora oscuridad.
Genial, ahora ya no tengo más lanzamisiles. No tengo bebé, jeringuillas bebé. Estoy en la lona. Mejor conmigo. ¿Te puedo asegurar que no? Que no es mejor que estén conmigo. Una jeringuilla bebé. Si no es mucha molestia. Uf.
Fontaine está cerca. Ya te estás acercando.
Sí, por algo me están dando tantas cosas. Por algo me están dando tantas cosas, un banco genético.
Bueno, tienes que usar la aguja de la Little Sister para extraer el Adam de Fontaine. Es el único modo de vencerlo.
Coge. Tíramelo al hombre malo.
Fontaine aguarda arriba. A partir de aquí no hay vuelta atrás. Asegúrate de estar listo para enfrentarte a él antes de continuar.
Me queda... ¡Ay, no me queda nada! No me queda uno.
¡Sacia tus ansias del Circus of Varios!
Sí, ahora me dan para que compre todo.
¡Sacia tus ansias del Circus of Varios!
Todo. Perfecto. Jardín, mejora de salud, mejora de héroe. Y nada más. Tonos físicos. Médico. Corrediza. Porrón. No más. Ya gasté todo lo que necesitaba. Lanza de fragmentación, tengo 5. Las de proximidad no. ¿Podría volver?
¡Bienvenido al bandido de la munición!
Que de proximidad no la tengo más. Punta 0.
Muchas gracias, señor. Bienvenido al bandido.
Vale.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Uf, ya estoy un poco nerviosa de lo que va a pasar. Ay, cargando contra Fontaine. Y lo voy a hacer fatal, pero fatal lo voy a hacer. Yo sé que lo voy a hacer fatal. Ya es mucho que haya llegado a este momento. Pero ya va siendo tiempo de que muera ese maldito Fontaine que jugó con nosotros, que experimentó con nosotros. ¿Todo por qué? Por poder. Por quedarse con Raptor para sí mismo. O sea, es una lucha de poder.
Recuerdo cuando la Germana y yo te pusimos en ese submarino, no tendrías más de 2 años. Sí, eras mi as en la manga, pero también eras lo más parecido que he tenido a un hijo. Por eso me duele esto. Traición, chico. La vida no es estrictamente negocios.
Justamente vos empezás a hablar de traición. Estoy re nerviosa.
chico! ¿Quieres ir en serio?
¿Dónde está? Ah. Una más.
Estoy solo en el mundo. Tengo idiotas de sobra para cubrirme las espaldas mientras recargo.
Vamos. Una más. Ah, casi. No me jodas. Ah, casi la tenía. No puedo creer que la primera le iba a hacer. Esto es feo. Ay, ya.
Y te encierro con todos los malditos. ¿Crees que estoy solo en el mundo? Tengo idiotas de sobra para cubrirme las espaldas mientras recargo.
Ay, no.
Esto es lo que recibo. ¿Crees que estoy solo en el mundo? Tengo idiotas de sobra para cubrirme las espaldas mientras recargo. Escoria insignificante. Voy a... Incluso esa vida que creíste tener fue algo que se me ocurrió y que grabé en tu cabeza. Si a eso no lo llamas familia, no sé qué más quieres. Y ahora...
Oh, sí, pequeña. Ustedes pueden. Ustedes pueden.
Me gusta el señor P.
Oh, sí. Vamos, chicas, vamos. Ustedes pueden. Pa, pam. Bien, ahí apuñalando.
Te ofrecieron la ciudad. Y la rechazaste. ¿Y qué hiciste en vez de eso? Lo que siempre has hecho. Las salvaste. Les diste precisamente lo que les había sido arrebatado.
Oh, qué lindo.
Una oportunidad. Una oportunidad de aprender. De encontrar el amor. De vivir. Y al final, ¿cuál fue tu recompensa? Nunca lo dijiste, pero creo que lo sé. Fueron ellas. Ellas. Y ellas también lo saben.
Sí. Fue más rápido de lo que yo pensaba. Bien.
I can feel the blood creeping up from the heathens. Got will, got fight, got pride, got reason. If they wanna go eat, then you know I'm gonna feed them. If you're coming for me, hope you're ready for a demon. I got eyes in the back of my head, I'm seeing.
Cosa que sí quiero ver. Ah, los comentarios del director. Vamos a ver los comentarios del director. Mira, me faltó unos cuantos. Un mundo de temas.
Rapture is overflowing with memorable locations and set pieces. In developing a world that feels organic, lived in, and functional, Irrational managed to create a space that feels perfectly suited to the story and action that takes place in it, which begs a question: did the plot shape the location, or did the plot fit squarely into a world that was already established?
Claro, porque en cada nivel había un comentario del director.
Let's talk about some of the areas in Rapture, because it's an amazing place, but also it feels like there's certain areas that are very well designed, and that they have, you know, a very certain aesthetic, and the characters in there, it all kind of comes together. Ken, do you have a part of Rapture that resonates the most with you still to this day?
I think the opening is always going to be the most important to me, because it's we spent a lot of time there, and it was all, for me as a challenge as a narrative guy, is sort of how do we set up a very complex series of events and a very complex notion, and all this, you know, Andrew, with so much to tell, Big Daddies and Little Sisters and Andrew Ryan and the time period, and do that all without cutscenes. And especially, I think, the descent to Rapture, when you're in that, when you get in the bathysphere, you know, getting that right, getting everything right down to the, you know, the bathysphere, cresting the hill and seeing the city for the first time. Remember how much we worked on the timing of that, just getting that.
And it took us forever to figure out that we should just put the slide projector covering the window. Like, again, in hindsight, it seems like such an obvious choice, but we were really trying to figure out, like, how are we going to tell this story of Ryan and then reveal, so you can see the, you know, the city beyond the hill.
And also, we didn't have to show the whole transition going down to the bottom of the ocean, because the whole screen was covered.
Spoiler alert.
I think that's the part that will always be near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was Kashmir.
Yeah.
That was one of the first...
The restaurant at the beginning.
Yeah, the restaurant at the beginning, because it was really like the first art box that we created that was Rapture. I mean, we created spaces before that weren't really hitting the Art Deco look. Scott Sinclair had just started, and he built that, designed and built that statue of the Atlas with the world on his shoulders that was in the middle of the room. And Mauricio had done some concept art for us of that space. And once we started putting everything together and getting it into Engine, and actually walking around it and seeing those giant windows off to the side that just showed the seascape and really drove home the fact that you were underwater. It was the first time really all the elements started to come together.
And we actually we had built a bunch of stuff, and we actually stepped back and said, we have to just get one room right before we go any further, because we weren't getting it right. And so Mauricio did that concept drawing.
Yep.
We worked really hard on that statue, and that statue, I think, was the first object we really built in the game that was a BioShock. So we just stayed in that room for like a month until we got it right.
And I think the original concept actually had a tram running through
it
it.
did.
So it was like even more complicated, and that was one of those things where we had to keep pulling back to really focus on what the bare essence of that room was.
Were there parts of Rapture that you never were able to realize that you sort of still missed? The zoo. People
we had
talked
a
about
zoo
Frolic, right?
that I was excited about. Not everybody was excited about the zoo, but I don't know why I was excited about the zoo, because it would have been a nightmare. We had another area that was prior to Arcadia that was more of a straight up agriculture, forest type of area.
Before we had the bathyspheres, we had a whole sort of subway transport system in Rapture, which we spent a lot of time thinking about, and then just realized that these little submersibles would be a much more realistic and much better solution.
And you were going to be able to move between locations in that subway system?
Yeah, much like the bathyspheres, but they were much more integrated throughout the space, and we really want to support them. And we just realized it was not really relevant to what we were doing.
Were there certain locations or areas where you knew a certain narrative point, needed to happen? Like you look at, the reveal of sort of Atlas's true motivations. Like, was that like, oh, we've got to do it this level because it fits the story? Or was it more that you sort of like, you had the game laid out in a certain order and you just layered the story on top of it?
I think the big one I can think of is that you encounter Ryan in his sort of like, that he would live in an area of industry.
Okay.
So he lives in this very industrial area because that's where he would feel most comfortable. And that we wanted his office, his lair, to sort of be not in some, residential zone, but where he wants to wake up and smell the grease fires and the machines and the smoke. That's in his lifeblood. Industry is his lifeblood.
But it also had to be very theatrical. Like if you look at it now, it doesn't look like an office. You kind of know it's an office because the story is telling you that.
Set, yeah.
And we had some old technology that was laying around in the game that would control environment settings. So old system that we had would let you do high pressure, low pressure, medium pressure. And those would affect lighting and other like post-process things in the world. And that was a system that was cut, but because the code was in, we were always trying to figure out ways to use it. And one of the ways that we used it was in the Andrew Ryan sequence, because we didn't have a lot of narrative storytelling tools. We were basically switching the atmosphere to get all the lighting changes. So whenever a light changes in that scene, we're telling the game that the atmosphere is changing. So, and then the preset atmospheres come in and shine the spotlights on them or bring up the house lights when we need them to.
Because very, very early on, you could change the pressure in the areas, and that would change how explosions worked and all this stuff like that. And we just couldn't figure out how to make it gettable for the player. We couldn't make it feedback, but we still had all those. That moved a lot of levers in the game, so we still had the system. So we used it for the sort of theatrical cues of the, very theatrical cues of Ryan appearing, the lights going down where you are, and the lights coming up where he is, because the engine didn't have those tools by default.
The assassin has overcome my final defense, and now he's come to murder me. In the end, what separates a man from a slave? Money? Power? No. A man chooses. A slave obeys.
And there was a great sense of sort of artistic progression as you went through the game too, and that each level had its own sort of voice. Was that something that a lot of games as they move further in development, it's like, oh, we sort of ran out of time. We can, it's like we're just going to sort of repeat this and change the color palette. It felt like, for the team, it was very defined from early on that you wanted each sort of level, which they were levels back in the day, to feel distinct.
Yeah, we had sort of experimented with that back on System Shock 2, back when every Doom level looked pretty much like every other Doom level, because they were just working on the same set of assets. We decided with our very rudimentary tools in System Shock 2 that we would progress with color, and every deck would feel different from a color standpoint, even though most of that was lighting, or textures, nothing really more. but we have the tools to actually, sort of theme levels. I think a lot of this goes back to, I think my first memory was actually from when I was 1 year old at the Montreal World Expo.
Remember when you were 1?
Well, I remember being at something at this World's Fair, which I didn't realize, I think, was in 1967 when I was 1 year old, a little over 1 year old.
Wow.
And I was on a theme park ride they had and I remember being at this thing where a big bat flies out of this sort of thing and comes up. I don't know why I was a 1 year old was on this ride. I'm not sure, sort of a haunted housey kind of ride. And I remember loving it. And I think that stuck with me. So the notion of sort of theme parky themes and settings, and Disney World does a great job with this. You can go to Disney World, they theme areas. So themed areas were something that always resonated with me. And BioShock sort of always has had this notion of feeling of theme in different areas, much more than the real world has. Like you walk from building to building, most then you can't really tell them apart. You walk from walk from a floor of an office building to another floor. It's not going to look any different. But we always felt that was really important.
And it's also, I mean, if you look at SWAT 4, saw some early experiments with this, especially like the serial killer's house level in SWAT 4, which is probably one of the most dense levels that we ship. But you were trying to tell a specific story with that. And going straight into BioShock and using the same exact engine that we're using, and we were very comfortable at that point with how the engine worked and how to art up these rooms, gave us a leg up when we sat down and really thought about what stories are we specifically trying to tell. And one of my favorite anecdotes from this time period is with Sander Cohen. I think it was Nate Wells and Stephen Alexander sat down one night, and they came up with a backstory for every dead body that you find in that space, and then they told that story with the props that they could. Even if it was just like, this guy crawled 3 feet and then shot himself in the head because he was sad about something, they put those marks in, maybe put a picture next to the guy, and then he shot himself. So they really did their homework and tried to add the backstory for everything that you're going to find in that space.
I've got Atlas's goons hitting us non-stop and 2 dead mechanics just this week. We need to control costs. If I wanted to deal with amateurs, I would have stayed on dry land.
Bien. Ahora solamente me queda uno. En el terreno de pruebas.
To kill, excuse me, to harvest or not to harvest, the moral dilemma that follows you throughout the BioShock experience and defines the fate of the player. This choice lays at the center of your BioShock story and has repercussions that can be felt in nearly every facet of the gameplay. Part of BioShock's lasting legacy, of course, are the Little Sisters and this moral choice that presented itself to the player. Everyone became a water cooler conversation about did you save them? Did you harvest them? That concept, Ken, was that something that came about early in development, or that binary choice? When did that come into the game?
I don't remember when. I mean, we had the concept of them being protected, but I can't remember when you actually
certainly
chose.
wasn't. When there were slugs, it was not meaningful. I think there was.
Do you salt it? Do you not salt it?
There were resources that you could get, but there was no choice there, right? The choice was, do I want to fight the Big Daddy or not?
Yeah.
I think once we got into the realm of they have to be empathetic, the player has to have some feeling towards them, which you're not going to get from slugs. Right. Then we start seeing that opportunity there of okay, nobody's going to want to do harm to these girls, or do they? And do we allow them to? It was we weren't comfortable with it at first when it first came out that we could.
I think it was important that it was a way to reflect the sort of larger economic questions of a world like Rapture, where where the economy drives everything. Are there any limits to economic decision making versus moral decision making? Because that's sort of what the Randian notion is that it's not the role that you don't sort of legislate morality. Let's try to take that to an extreme and see where that ends up. And Little Sisters sort of became that. And in this world, they became a commodity. And the question we have for the players, are you willing, they're a commodity to you as well, potentially. Are you willing to participate in the commodification? There was, I think, a fair amount of nervousness internally at the publisher about it for a little while, but pretty quickly they were able to sort of say, look, we trust you guys and go, do this. And I only had a few, the press, and this sort of happens over and over again. The games press worried a ton about it and would wring their hands about it. They ever recognized it was a upsetting topic, but that it was done to a larger purpose, that it wasn't just sort of like, hey, this is the game where you kill children. And
whatever, and that was a sensitivity. I know that you guys wanted to call them little sisters, not little girls, and it was and it wasn't, it wasn't killing them, it was harvesting them. And I mean, you did some things probably on purpose, right, to sort of explain that this, you weren't doing anything vicious to them, right?
Well, I mean, you do sort of, they do sort of disappear out of you, and a big slug out of their belly, comes up that you. Well, we didn't want that to be graphic. We wanted to be very clear that you were killing them.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But it was not intended to be a prurient in terms of, hey, this is a simulation of pulling a sea slug out of a little girl's belly. But we wanted you to understand that you were making a very diabolical moral economic pact there. And we think that came across, and I think it came across well enough. And I think the test of how well it came across is, I think most people didn't really thought of it as am I willing to do this thing or not?
Right.
And people would tell us stories how their girlfriend saw them harvesting, and then they literally slept on the couch that night. Right. And that's an interesting, that was interesting how people connected to a 3D mesh that's really no different than any other 3D mesh in the world. This little sister, she's not a person. She's a 3D asset, a virtual 3D asset, right? That has a voice actor connected to it who's an adult woman. And nobody was actually getting harmed, but people still emotionally connected to them and made an emotional connection.
And also, I think when you're playing, you don't really know what the impact of that choice is. Yes. And that's sort of the curiosity of you're a gamer, so it's like, am I going to game the system? Which one should I pick? How does this impact things as you go through the game? It's never really fully clear what that choice is going to lead to, right? And the ambiguousness of that was something you wanted to sort of create mystery around throughout the game?
Yeah, we went back and forth a lot about what the rewards for harvesting versus saving would be, and actually I think we should have really pushed further that the rewards for saving were should have been much more meager than the rewards for harvesting, just to really sort of put you up against the wall, push you up against the wall and say, are you going to stick by your moral guns here? Because you're going to pay for it. Because that's usually the way life is, right? It's always harder to take a moral path than it is to take an amoral path. But there's incentives to take amoral paths because it's the easier path.
As you play through the game, eventually you get to the ending, and as we know now, there were sort of two endings that were affected by that choice. And that was something at the time, I know you said publicly that you weren't in favor of sort of having two endings. Was that in part because, the game is about not having choice, or did you think that, the two endings were, I don't know, I'm interested for narratively, why you didn't want to go that path?
It seemed forced, given that the game really sort of almost made a joke, a meta commentary joke about the lack of agency in games, the lack of meaning of those choices, given that you have these two endings. I guess you could make an argument that, well, you were free, you were given choice of once Ryan's dead, and that's really what it's about. But I think we also didn't really have enough time to execute on those super well. I was pretty happy with how the happier one came out, with the sort of little sister focus, but it's a much more subtle story than I would have time to tell about your slow descent into, moral chaos and dissolute living and all the things that sort of come along with a life that is sort of separate from a moral structure. It's a long story.
And also, you were just switching a cutscene. It wasn't like you were doing sort of a whole other level that was different or something. So the choice was...
There's two cutscenes with very tight time and economic
Or
constraints.
just start a nuclear war.
Yes. And that's not...
You're a nice guy, or you start a nuclear war.
And because we had so many problems on our plate, that was something I had to sort of do in the spare time. So I was pretty happy with one, but not very happy with the other.
I know you had said publicly before that there was another sort of more ambiguous ending that you had originally planned, or what would you have done?
There was a notion of an ambiguous ending, in which if I just wrote one, I would have found a way that would just talk about the moral ambiguity of the world rather than the sort of, positive or negative, because it is such a, look, I think we really tried with BioShock not to sort of make a game about good and evil. It was really about circumstances and what circumstances lead people to, right, and how they delude themselves with ideology to do things that they would think are evil, but it's okay because it's for the good cause. Right. And that's what I probably would have. If I just had one to write, I'd probably focus more on that. How difficult it is to sort of align when you start being driven by ideology rather than being in the moment and thinking about the impact of what you're doing.
Sean, you talked to gamers, I'm sure, over the years. Did you ever get a sense of how many people harvested versus saved, and was there any sort of data? I mean, this is before the days where you get telemetry and data on like what people picked and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, it seems like more people saving Little Sisters. Although, I have a few friends that were. I just harvested every single one. I wanted to see what happened. So I don't know if that was more, the game developer and them trying to see, what would happen. But certainly for the most part, I think most people, which I guess is a good thing. It means that maybe people are good at heart. They kind of feel bad. They want they want to save the Little Sisters. So yeah, I'll say it. The needle sways towards the green there.
Time for bed, Mr. B. Hurry, Mr. Bubbles.
Bueno, perfecto. Y ahora solamente me queda que quieras al museo. Me parece muy interesante el tema del museo. Estos son una interna y racional para esta variante, un prototipo de Big Daddy que atacaba a los jugadores con un inmenso gancho y disparaba piezas de hierro con un cañón. Todo cuerpo a cuerpo jodido. Sobrevivió lo suficiente como para convertirse en una IA totalmente funcional, pero el equipo lo eliminó al final y se centró en perfeccionar los demás tipos de Big Daddy. Este modelo apareció posteriormente en BioShock 2 como el Rambler y lanzaba torretas en miniatura, bolas de cañón. O sea que en BioShock 2 aparece. O sea, este modelo original de gorila incluye una perforadora de cabeza plana en el extremo de cabros. Se considera como constructores de Rapture con armas modificadas a partir de las armas de construcción. Cuando los ejecutores pasaron a ser líderes, una de las pruebas de la gorila se cambió por una mano con guante para que ambas pruebas pudieran interactuar. La recolectora. Puede que resulte difícil que esta criatura, cuyo trabajo consistía en recoger a los cadáveres de Rapture, fuera la repetición primigenia de la idea que subyace bajo el término de Little Sister. Como las recolectoras no despertaban ninguna simpatía entre los jugadores, el equipo experimentó con conceptos para incluir una serie de animales, incluido el tristemente célebre perro en silla de ruedas y un posterior y grotesco humanoide en miniatura. Finalmente, un boceto de una niña deformada dio pie al momento de inspiración del que nacieron los Little Sisters. Claro, si vos me ves un bicho así, no tendré ningún problema en cosecharlas en vez de salvarlas. Antes de concretar la ficción relacionada con el Adam, Irrational experimentó con la idea de que fuera una sustancia externa e inyectable, Aquí se puede ver cómo experimentamos con Adam inyectando mecánicamente. Por eso este splicer lleva frascos en el cinturón. Dice el jefe de diseño John Roberts. Este modelo se diseñó, pero no lleva a aparecer en el juego de ninguna forma. Ah, claro. O sea que me podía enfrentar a este tipo de bicho, pero al final no. Menos mal. Diseño preliminar de Splicer. Esto es una de las primeras bases de lo que los enemigos de BioShock iban evolucionando hacia un concepto más cercano a lo humano. Los diseñadores unieron este enfoque con la idea de que el Adam deformaba el cuerpo de algún modo relacionado con el propósito del personaje. Por ejemplo, un brazo grotesco y gigante en un enemigo que lucha cuerpo a cuerpo. Sí, como este, por ejemplo. Sí, bien. Amorfo. El primer splash que Ryan diseñó para BioShock. Amorfo se usó en muchas demos iniciales y contó con funcionalidad completa en el juego en cuanto a movimientos, reacción ante impactos y doblaje de voz. Nos costó mucho tiempo darnos cuenta de que no era un buen modelo. Es probablemente el peor aborto que ha creado nunca Irrational. ¿En serio? Me vas a acordar un poco de Resident Evil. A ese grandote de virus T, creo que era. Dice la primera plaza, el paso grotesco humano fue un proceso lento. En los conceptos frenados, los enemigos de modo cuerpo a cuerpo desarrollaron unos brazos monstruosos. El equipo tenía problemas para representar a alguien que había tomado plasmidos para convertirse en tirador. Estos son de la primera del Big Daddy tipo Rossi, que igual que el gorila se consideró como un obrero cuya misión pasó a ser la de proteger a las recolectoras. Bueno, sí, lo mismo. Versión blanco y negro y versión color. Más Big Daddies. Diseño de protector. Los Big Daddies, originalmente conocidos como protectores, se concibieron como trabajadores de la construcción con trajes de buzo encargados de la defensa de las recolectoras de Adam. Usaban herramientas de construcción o armas improvisadas que parecía que habían encontrado en el fondo marino. A la derecha se muestra diseños iniciales de los proyectos hechos en cuerpo a distancia y con proyectiles lentos. Bien. Otro estilo voz. Este es tipo granadero. Este splice gris gigante fue un granadero, preliminar de la misma pela en que se desarrollaron Amorfo y Gancho. Era un ser que tomaba plásmidos para lanzarte granadas gigantes. A este modo se le aplicaron texturas aunque nunca llegó a animarse. Estudio ambiental preliminar. La ubicación que aquí se muestra se creó como la demo de Visionario. Un pequeño nivel que mostraba varios elementos clave del juego como las Big Daddy y las recolectoras. Bounty. Esta zona aparece en el nivel de Neptune Bounty y BioShock, pero los cuervos que flotaban en el océano se eliminaron en una fase posterior del desarrollo al verse que sus sombras distraen demasiado con respecto a la acción de la sala. ¿Y este? Gancho. Esta espada se crea en la misma época que Amorfo y Granadero. Todo el nombre de Gancho por el arma que usa. Este diseño evolucionó hacia el Splicer Araña cuando se decidió que los modelos de Splicer podían adaptarse a cualquier comportamiento. El modelo Gancho se compró más tarde en Splicer Bebé. Ah, claro, sí, tiene su parecido. Este es por ahí el que más sobrevivió, el del gancho. Diseño de Big Daddy. Este es el diseño primero que muestra un Big Daddy destrozando una pared. Este sería el registro de audio de la zona de entrenamiento de Big Daddy sobre un Big Daddy salvaje. Pues al final del nivel. Ah, mira. Luego bahía submarina. Este boceto muestra lo que más tarde se convertiría en una bahía submarina. Una zona que albergaba un importante escenario para Atlas. Ah, cuando supuestamente nos encontramos con la familia de Atlas. Sí. Bueno, el eslabón perdido. Este personaje básicamente es el eslabón perdido entre los primeros diseños grotescos y los players más humanos que aparecen en BioShock. Se trata del último modelo malo que hicimos antes de pasar el diseño que se incluyó al final en el juego. Después de experimentar con él un tiempo, pensamos, ¿por qué no usamos mejor humanos? Siempre pensé en ellos como en monstruos de Scooby-Doo, porque eran tan inhumanos que no provocaban empatía alguna. Tampoco es que los players recibían mi empatía, que digamos. Este fue el cuarto diseño de protector y se creó originalmente con la babosa orgánica pegada. Se empezó a trabajar en un modelo, pero nunca se completó porque el equipo se centró en tres. Finalmente en dos tipos de Big Daddy. Me sigue gustando como protector, dice el diseñador Rob Waters. Empezamos con el modelo y yo hice lo posible porque este entrara, aunque fuera como modelo estático del suelo, pero no pudo ser. Uy, ¿este? Aquí se muestran algunos ejemplos preliminares de elementos para BioShock, de la época en la que Irrational seguía trabajando en SWAT 4. Las únicas ideas concretas en aquel momento eran una ciudad bajo el mar y la experimentación biológica, así que los primeros diseños se centraron en dichas temáticas. Claro, totalmente distinto a lo que fue al final. Sí, lo mismo. Mana de Boniato. Este personaje llamado Consorna Mana de Boniato fue el gran exponente de la fase conceptual que precedió a la decisión que los enemigos fueran humanos. Yo destacaría los dibujos que se esconden tras el modelo. Se puede ver que el de arriba se llevó a crear, pero los otros dos influyeron en el diseño también. A medida que nos acercamos a los humanoides, los monstruos de Scooby-Doo se volvieron más bobalicones y menos temibles. Fauna marina. Estas criaturas marinas se entendidas más como una sorpresa inesperada para visitantes del museo que como un concepto descartado. Van nadando al lado del jugador durante su paso en la batisfera por Raptor en la secuencia de introducción de BioShock. Diseño concepto de RAM. Esta fue la primera imagen que capturó de forma real todos los elementos visuales constitutivos de BioShock. Una amplia lista del océano, el escenario de iluminación acuática y los elegantes elementos de diseño Art Deco. Sin esta imagen, BioShock habría sido algo totalmente diferente. Sí, tal cual. Sí, algo que me gustaba mucho en BioShock fue la vista. La vista me parecía hermoso. Cada vez que podía, lo miraba. Este diseño preliminar del salón de la flota de Sander Cohen se creó después de que empezara la construcción de niveles. Cuando los diseñadores se dieron cuenta de que no estaba resultando fácil conceptualizar el espacio del teatro, fue uno de los primeros espacios creados para BioShock y muchos de los elementos empleados en este museo proceden de él. Ah, mira. Creo que nada más. No hay mucho más. Creo que ya está, no hay nada más para mirar. Ya está. Cosas. Creo que me queda solamente. Los artistas de Irrational intentaron imaginarse cómo funcionó la ciudad bajo el mar en este diseño conceptual preliminar a Rapture. En una de las ideas se imaginaba un bosque denso para el intercambio de oxígeno, que se muestra aquí como con una pasarela de observación que lo bordea. El concepto del uso de árboles para el intercambio de oxígeno apareció en el juego definido en el nivel de arcade. Sí. Creo que nada más.